September 25, 1986. Near the city of Jalalabad, the Afghan sun performs its daily ritual, dipping below the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Hindu Kush. It casts long skeletal shadows that crawl across the valley floor, painting the landscape in hues of orange and deep purple. High above this starkly beautiful terrain, a Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunship, a machine rightfully feared as a flying tank, banks low over a ridge. Its pilot, a seasoned veteran of this brutal war, is wrapped in a cocoon of utter confidence. His cockpit is a world of gauges and the steady thrum of powerful engines. He's hugging the terrain, a classic tactic, believing the granite and earth below will shield him from the scattered, ragtag collection of guerrillas he's been sent to hunt. In this moment, he feels utterly untouchable, a god in a machine, the very harbinger of Soviet military might. But he is tragically, catastrophically wrong. On the ground, hidden in the encroaching twilight, a Gilzai tribesman adjusts his position. The weight of the launcher, serial number X-178, feels solid and real against his shoulder. He is not a soldier in a conventional army. He is a fighter defending his home, and he has been given a tool of unimaginable power. He breathes, steadies his aim, and with a conviction forged in years of resistance, squeezes the trigger. The Hind pilot never sees it coming. There is no warning, no radar signature, nothing to alert him that his dominance is about to end. A missile, a streak of heat-seeking vengeance traveling at over twice the speed of sound, erupts from the tube. It doesn't just fly, it hunts. In a few heartbeats, it finds its target. The impact is surgically precise and breathtakingly violent. The tail boom of the mighty Hind shears off as if made of paper. The massive rotors freeze in midair for a fraction of a second, and in the space of a mere 8 seconds, that roaring machine, that airborne symbol of a superpower's aerial dominance, transforms into a catastrophic fireball. It pancakes into a wheat field below, a funeral pyre marking the end of an era. This is not an isolated incident, not a lucky shot in a forgotten war. That helicopter is just the first of nearly 300 Soviet aircraft that will be violently, unceremoniously knocked out of the sky by a weapon roughly the size of a mailbox. A weapon that fundamentally rewrote the rules of asymmetric warfare. And here's the kicker, the truly mind-bending, labyrinthine part of this story. That missile, it was designed and built in America. It was bought and paid for with U.S. tax dollars. It was smuggled into the highlands of Afghanistan by the Central Intelligence Agency, and then in a twist of geopolitical irony that feels almost poetic in its cruel symmetry, within 5 short years of the Soviet withdrawal, some of those very same missiles would be actively aimed right back at Americans. This isn't just ancient history, a dusty chapter from the Cold War. It is a living, breathing saga whose epilogue is still being written in today's headlines, a stark reminder that the ghosts of covert wars never truly rest. To understand why an American missile ended up on the shoulder of an Afghan tribesman, we must be clear. The conflict in Afghanistan was never just about Afghanistan. For the global superpowers, it was about a sprawling, high-stakes game of global chess, played out on a board that stretched from the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., to the gilded halls of the Kremlin in Moscow. Afghanistan, with its formidable terrain and fiercely independent people, was a crucial, albeit entirely unwilling pawn in this deadly game. By December 1979, the world watched as the Soviet Red Army did more than just conduct a border patrol. This was a full-scale invasion. Columns of tanks and armored personnel carriers rolled across the Amu Darya River, a massive strategic move to prop up a failing communist puppet regime in Kabul. For the Kremlin planners, this was the culmination of a long-held strategic dream. Suddenly, the ambition of warm-water ports, an obsession dating back to the era of Peter the Great, a centuries-old geopolitical craving for year-round, ice-free access to the globe's vital shipping lanes, looked tantalizingly within reach. This wasn't just about naval access, it was about projecting power, about breaking the geographic constraints that had always limited Russia's global influence. Now imagine the nightmare scenario unfolding in the Situation Room in Washington. Soviet tanks, having consolidated their position in Afghanistan, could theoretically push south through Pakistan's Baluchistan province and rumble onto the shores of the Indian Ocean. What would that truly mean? It meant Moscow gaining the terrifying ability to potentially throttle the vital oil lanes streaming from the Persian Gulf, placing a chokehold on the energy supply that powered the entire Western world. It meant outflanking NATO from the south, fundamentally and perhaps irrevocably shifting the delicate balance of power in the Cold War. The domino theory, which had haunted American foreign policy for decades, wasn't just a dry academic concept anymore. It felt like a very real and very imminent threat unfolding in real time.
The United States could not, and would not, stand by. Officially, of course, the public response was one of outrage. The U.S. condemned the invasion with the full force of diplomatic rhetoric at the United Nations and organized a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. But unofficially, behind the thick, soundproof doors of the White House and CIA headquarters, a much different, much more direct kind of response was already in motion. Within just 2 weeks of the first Soviet T-72 tank rumbling through the streets of Kabul, a covert CIA team landed in Islamabad, Pakistan. They didn't come with diplomatic notes. They came with a briefcase full of cash and a single, brutally pragmatic question for Pakistan's top generals. How fast can you get guns to the tribesmen who hate communists even more than they hate each other? The stage was set. The players were in position. A proxy war that would reshape the world was about to begin. That urgent question, posed in a smoke-filled room in Islamabad, was the genesis of what would become Operation Cyclone. This clandestine program would grow into the longest and arguably one of the most expensive covert actions in the entire history of the CIA. Initially, the budget was a symbolic zero, a clever accounting trick to ensure plausible deniability, a testament to the early cautious approach, or perhaps a way to obscure its true origins from congressional oversight. But that caution evaporated as the scale of the Soviet occupation became clear. The budget didn't just grow, it exploded. By 1980, Operation Cyclone was being funded to the tune of $20 to $30 million a year. It was a significant sum, but still just a trickle. By 1984, as the war intensified, that trickle had become a river, with the annual budget swelling to an incredible $200 million. At its absolute peak in 1987, the program was commanding an astounding $630 million per year. To put that in perspective, we're talking about billions of dollars in 1980s money, funneled into one of the most remote, impoverished, and mountainous countries on Earth. The singular goal of this massive expenditure was brutally simple: to bleed the Soviet Union, to turn Afghanistan into Moscow's Vietnam, a quagmire that would drain its treasury, demoralize its army, and cripple its international standing. But how did this massive influx of cash and aid actually reach the fighters on the ground, the men who would come to be known as the Mujahideen? The CIA made a pivotal decision early on. The flow of weapons would be deliberately and exclusively routed through Pakistan's powerful and shadowy intelligence agency, the Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI. The ISI became the indispensable middleman, a crucial, if sometimes deeply problematic partner. This arrangement offered the CIA a layer of deniability. The weapons weren't being handed over directly by American agents, but it also gave the ISI immense leverage. They took their cut, both in weapons and in cash, and used their position to funnel the lion's share of the aid north across the rugged, porous border into Afghanistan. Crucially, the ISI often favored the more radical Islamist groups, like that of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, over more moderate factions, believing these hardline groups would be the most effective fighters, and just as importantly, would remain aligned with Pakistani interests after the war. For the first 5 long years of the conflict, the cargo being sent into Afghanistan was relatively modest. It consisted largely of antiquated but reliable World War II-era Lee-Enfield rifles, a vast supply of Chinese-made AK-47s, and ubiquitous RPG-7 anti-tank rockets. These were certainly enough to harass the Soviet invaders, to conduct ambushes and sow chaos. But they were not enough to win. They were not enough to challenge the Soviets' greatest advantage. By 1985, the war had settled into a brutal, grinding stalemate. It was a war of 2 different dimensions. The Soviets owned the skies. Their Mi-24 Hinds and Su-25 Frogfoot jets would obliterate anything that moved in the open during the day. Their overwhelming air superiority was a constant, demoralizing threat that pinned the Mujahideen down and restricted their movements. Meanwhile, the Afghan fighters owned the night. They would emerge from their mountain strongholds to ambush Soviet convoys, winding through treacherous passes, striking quickly and then vanishing like ghosts into the labyrinthine terrain they knew so well. One side dominated the skies with overwhelming firepower. The other clung to the shadows with local knowledge and fierce determination. The war was costing Moscow dearly, but there was no end in sight. The strategists in Washington knew they needed a game changer. They needed something to break the stalemate, to level the playing field. They needed an equalizer. And that equalizer arrived in the form of a 27-pound plastic tube. That unassuming tube housed the FIM-926 Stinger, a man-portable air defense system, or MANPADS. This wasn't some clunky, complicated piece of machinery. It was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. A passive infrared, shoulder-fired missile that didn't emit any signals for an enemy aircraft to detect. It simply hunted for heat, locking onto the exhaust of a helicopter or a low-flying jet with terrifying tenacity. Its genius lay in its profound simplicity. With just 8 hours of dedicated training, a 15-year-old boy could learn to acquire and lock on to an aircraft's heat plume from 6 kilometers away. It was a true fire-and-forget system. Once the missile was launched, the gunner could dive for cover while the missile guided itself to the target. This single capability represented a seismic shift in the nature of the war. In September 1985, CIA Director Bill Casey, a fervent Cold Warrior, walked into the Oval Office. He laid out the situation for President Reagan in stark terms. Give the Afghan fighters Stinger missiles, and we will flip the entire air war on its head. It was an incredibly high-stakes gamble. The Pentagon and the State Department vehemently hated the idea. They were haunted by the nightmare scenario of these advanced, portable, and deadly weapons falling into the wrong hands. Terrorist groups, drug cartels, or hostile nations. It was a deeply valid concern, one that would, in time, prove chillingly prescient. But Reagan, ever the decisive leader when it came to confronting the evil empire, sided with his CIA director. He wanted to win, not just bleed the Soviets. 6 weeks later, the presidential finding was signed, and the first batch of missiles secretly arrived in the port of Karachi. From there, their journey became even more clandestine. They were driven north in ordinary vegetable trucks, repackaged at ISI compounds, and disguised as crates of cucumbers to pass through border checkpoints. By the time of that first spectacular kill in September 1986, word of the new weapon had spread like wildfire through the Mujahideen ranks. Every commander wanted this new magic wand. The balance of power in the skies over Afghanistan had just been irrevocably and violently altered. The effect of the Stinger was nothing short of a tactical shockwave that reverberated all the way back to Moscow. Within 6 short months of its introduction, the Soviets were losing on average an aircraft every 24 hours. Pilots who once confidently hugged the valley floors, flying low and fast to deliver their payloads with precision, were now forced to climb above 20,000 feet. Flying low had become suicidal. But operating at such extreme altitudes came with its own crippling disadvantages. It cut their effective bomb loads in half and made providing accurate close air support for their ground troops virtually useless. Helicopter operations, once the cornerstone of their counterinsurgency strategy, were increasingly restricted to the cover of night, a far more dangerous and demanding environment that strained crews and equipment to their absolute limits. Soviet commanders on the ground, in their own after-action reports, admitted that the Stinger didn't just destroy expensive machines, it destroyed confidence. Morale among Soviet air crews, once sky-high, plummeted. Meanwhile, the Mujahideen, emboldened and empowered, adapted their tactics with lethal ingenuity. They developed a brutally effective 1-2 punch. A small group of fighters would deliberately expose itself, acting as bait to draw a curious gunship in. As the helicopter circled its prey, a second hidden team, positioned on an unexpected ridge, would pop a Stinger from an angle the pilot could never anticipate. It was a simple, repeatable, and devastatingly effective piece of battlefield choreography. The kill ratio in 1987, the peak year of the Stinger's use, approached an astonishing 80%. By the CIA's own calculations, every $38,000 Stinger missile was, on average, taking out a $12 million Mi-24 Hind. That is what spies call asymmetric arithmetic. A cheap, simple weapon inflicting crippling, unsustainable damage on a far more expensive and complex enemy asset. The Soviet Union, of course, was not going to just roll over and accept defeat. They responded with their own countermeasures. Mi-24s were rapidly and crudely outfitted with infrared flares designed to decoy the Stinger seeker, and exhaust baffles were installed to try and cool the heat signature. On the ground, the Soviets escalated their reprisals with a chilling new level of brutality. Chemical-laden butterfly mines designed to maim children were scattered across vast areas from the air. Scorched village campaigns, where entire communities were wiped out in retaliation for a Stinger attack, became commonplace. Elite GRU and Spetsnaz hit squads were deployed with the specific mission of hunting down and eliminating Stinger teams. Yet in the end, none of it truly worked. The flares could be overcome, and the hit squads could be ambushed. The Stingers had forced a fundamental doctrinal pivot. Air power, the crown jewel of Soviet operational art, the very thing that was supposed to guarantee victory in Afghanistan, had suddenly become too risky to use effectively. Facing mounting casualties, a demoralized military, and a war that was draining the national treasury, The Kremlin's general staff secretly conceded that the war was, quite simply, unwinnable. Planning for a, quote, dignified withdrawal began in secret.
Covert wars always look cheap on paper, a clean solution to a messy problem. But the bill always arrives, and often with crushing compound interest. The Stinger program was no exception. Each Stinger unit wasn't just a missile, it was a system, which included a reusable launcher, a disposable battery coolant unit, and a 30-page technical manual written in dense, technical English that absolutely nobody on the receiving end could read. In a classic example of field improvisation, the CIA printed up Pashto Prib notes, simple illustrated instructions, laminated them against the harsh Afghan climate, and literally duct-taped them to the side of the launch tube. Training happened in secret camps outside Rawalpindi, Pakistan, consisting of a grueling 8 hours of classroom instruction, followed by 2 live firings at drone targets. The total estimated cost per trained gunner was an eye-watering $42,000. Multiply that by the 1,200 gunners the program eventually trained, and you begin to grasp the immense hidden scale of the operation. And where did the money come from? Did Congress see a line item in the defense budget labeled Stinger missiles for Afghan rebels? Of course not. This was black ops money, funded from shadowy off-the-books accounts. In a further twist, the CIA had brokered a deal where Saudi Arabia, eager to see the atheist Soviets bleed, agreed to match Washington's contributions dollar for dollar. In essence, American taxpayers ended up paying for this program twice, once to ship these sophisticated weapons into a war zone, and then again, years later, to try and buy back the ones that survived the conflict. When the last exhausted Soviet column finally trundled back across the Haratan Bridge in February 1989, leaving Afghanistan behind, a brand new nightmare began for the CIA. An estimated 1,200 Stinger missiles and their launchers remained unaccounted for, scattered among dozens of quarreling Mujahideen commanders who were already beginning to turn their guns on each other. The weapon that had won the war was now a terrifyingly dangerous loose end. In 1990, the agency launched Operation Mias, better known as the Stinger Buyback Program. Initially budgeted at a hopeful $10 million, the cost quickly ballooned to $55 million. The price offered was a staggering $80,000 in cash per tube, no questions asked, more than double the missile's original cost. The program was an unmitigated disaster, plagued with scams and fraud. Cunning middlemen brought in empty crates filled with rocks. Others sold the CIA repainted, inferior Soviet SA-7 missiles. In the end, only about 310 genuine launchers were recovered, leaving an estimated 600 or more still out there in the wild. The Pentagon's original fears of proliferation were not just founded, they were becoming a reality. In 1993, a Stinger from the original Afghan stockpiles was used to down a Bosnian Serb jet during the war in the Balkans. By 1998, intelligence reports placed at least 4 Stinger systems in the hands of Iran, where they were reportedly being reverse-engineered. And in the tense months following the 9/11 attacks in 2001, rumors swirled that al-Qaeda itself had acquired at least 3. The boomerang had come back around, and it was sharper and more dangerous than ever imagined. The weapons were only half of the legacy. The other, more devastating half was the people. The CIA's secret war, in its single-minded focus on defeating the Soviets, had inadvertently created and nurtured a globalized generation of radicalized Islamist fighters. They came from across the Arab world to participate in the jihad against the Red Army, and they came to believe, correctly, from their unique perspective, that they, the holy warriors, had single-handedly defeated a godless superpower.
When the Soviet war ended, Washington, believing its mission was accomplished, abruptly closed the cash valve and walked away. The flow of billions of dollars stopped overnight. Afghanistan, deprived of its unifying enemy and awash in advanced weaponry, immediately imploded into one of the most brutal civil wars of the 20th century. The capital city of Kabul was shelled to rubble by rival warlords, many of whom were still clutching their American-supplied weapons as they fought for control. Out of that bloody, fratricidal chaos rose the Taliban, a movement of ultra-conservative students nourished in the madrasas of Pakistan and inspired by the intoxicating, powerful narrative that holy warriors could indeed bring down empires. It was no coincidence that Mullah Omar, the enigmatic early leader of the Taliban, kept a spent Stinger launch tube in the Kandahar governor's compound as a treasured trophy. It was a symbol of his belief in divine victory. Osama bin Laden, watching all of this unfold from his base in Afghanistan, drew his own, far more global conclusions. He saw the Soviet withdrawal not just as a local victory, but as a viable template. He explicitly cited the Afghan victory in his 1998 fatwa declaring a holy war against the United States. His message was chilling and clear and direct. The United States was a paper tiger, and its military and economy could be crippled by 1,000 cuts. Bleed the United States, he urged his followers, the same way you bled the Soviets. The blowback had come full circle. The training, the ideology, and the very weapons used to defeat one superpower were now being repurposed to attack the other. Fast forward to 2022. The world watched in awe as Ukrainian troops, defending their homeland against a Russian invasion, fired American-made Stinger missiles at Russian attack aircraft over Kyiv. It was a surreal, almost ghostly echo of the past. The missile itself was virtually identical to the ones shipped to Afghanistan back in 1986. The world, remembering the Stinger's giant-killing reputation, rallied to Ukraine's side. Washington, Berlin, and even Taipei began shipping thousands of units to the front lines. Immediately, analysts and historians began to debate. Would Ukraine become another Afghanistan, a future source of catastrophic blowback? There's one crucial difference this time. A testament to hard-learned, bloody lessons. The buyback clause isn't a desperate post-war afterthought. It's already written directly into the modern Lend-Lease contracts. The U.S. and its allies are attempting to preempt the proliferation nightmare before it even begins, demanding tracking and return of the weapons once the conflict ends. History never repeats itself exactly, but covert programs and the weapons they employ certainly seem to recycle. So after all this, what did the CIA actually learn from its secret war in Afghanistan? The lessons are as clear as they are sobering. First, shoulder-fired missiles are a uniquely dangerous form of proliferation. They travel easily across black markets and become persistent, generational threats long after a conflict officially ends. Second, proxies have long memories but very short loyalty. Today's celebrated freedom fighter can all too easily become tomorrow's sworn enemy. Third, in the modern age of global media and satellite imagery, true plausible deniability is a mirage. Fourth, every covert success story tends to spawn an unauthorized sequel you may not like. Fifth, Congress will eagerly fund the secret war, but will almost always underfund the messy, expensive cleanup. Sixth, traditional metrics of victory, like an enemy withdrawal, rarely measure the true long-term strategic blowback. And seventh, in our interconnected world, the planet is far smaller and more volatile than a Stinger's 6-kilometer range. The Stinger missile did what a decade of diplomacy and economic sanctions could not. It humbled the mighty Red Army, it shattered their aerial dominance, and for better or for worse,
it etched an indelible American footprint on the mountains of the Hindu Kush. In the annals of the Cold War, it became the undisputed symbol of Soviet defeat. But in doing so, it also seeded a global weapons bazaar that still haunts intelligence reports and security briefings to this day. The very same launch tube that helped end one empire's ambitions in Central Asia inadvertently emboldened the rise of a far more dangerous idea: the potent, viral notion that even the mightiest superpowers can be bled, broken, and beaten. The CIA's secret war in Afghanistan isn't a dusty historical footnote. It is a live tutorial on the perilous nature of how nations wage war in the shadows, and the profound, unforeseen, and often tragic consequences that inevitably follow. If history is a guide, the next time an unassuming plastic tube appears on a foreign battlefield, someone in a quiet office in Langley, Virginia, will undoubtedly glance at the serial number and mutter with a profound sense of irony and dread, "I thought we bought that one back."